Morning. This is Dr. Hansa Das, and once again, I welcome you to the lecture series on Russian history. In the last video, we had talked about war communism, and today's lecture will focus upon the new economic policy in Russia, 1921 to 1928. We had seen that war communism had brought unprecedented chaos and anarchy in the Russian economy and the entire country. And in order to improve the situation of the economy, Lenin decided in March 1921 to introduce a new policy which would include certain elements of capitalism in order to boost the Russian economy. And therefore, in 1921, the NEP was introduced. So, in the years 1921, 22, and a few years thereafter, the entire socio-economic balance of Russia shifted. And from the period of war communism, Russia was gradually moving towards the new economic policy. The new economic policy had brought about major changes in agriculture, industry, labor, trade unions, finance, etc. And today we are going to talk about those changes. In this presentation, we will basically discuss number one, the background to the new economic policy, in which we will talk about the agricultural difficulties and industrial difficulties which the economy was facing during the time of war communism. Second, we will discuss about the changes that came about in agriculture, and third, in industry. Let us talk about the background to the new economic policy and the mishaps that happened during the period of war communism. So, the period prior to the new economic policy was that of war communism, and by 1921, the negative effects of war communism had become clearly evident. Communism certainly had not begun on a good note, and so it was decided by Lenin that he would start a capitalist experiment to which he gave the name New Economic Policy or NEP. As already said, we will discuss about the agricultural difficulties and industrial difficulties under war communism. In agricultural field, there was an attempt during war communism to ban private manufacture and to nationalize nearly all industry. There was also a ban on private trade. And the most important feature of war communism in the field of agriculture was prodrazverstka, which meant forcible seizure of peasant surpluses. There were expropriations, requisitions, terror, and arbitrariness, and the state used to forcibly seize the surplus of the peasants. War communism was therefore a siege economy with a communist ideology. All these features had their repercussions in every field. The cumulative effect of years of Prodrazvostka had caused a marked reduction of sowings, and above all, there was a serious drought in the east and southeast. Since the peasants were left with a bare minimum to feed themselves, to feed them and their families, there was hardly anything left with the peasants on which they could rely, and the result was an appalling famine. Diseases spread throughout the country. There were industrial difficulties too, as a result of the fuel crisis under war communism, causing the closure of many state operated factories. 1921 was a nightmare year for the people and government alike. Materials and fuel had to be bought, workers had to be paid, necessary resources would have to be maintained from sales, and under these economic pressures, there were no easy sources of credit. Industry was divided into autonomous units called trusts, and by early 1922, these trusts were having to fend for themselves. There was desperate general shortage all over. Factories and trusts had little cash, and all these things led to a relative fall in prices of industrial goods as compared with foodstuffs. Prices often failed to cover costs, and throughout the country, there was growing unemployment. The transport situation was equally bad, and the value of ruble also continued to depreciate with startling rapidity. Eventually, Bolsheviks and mainly Lenin came to realize that Russia was beginning to drown underneath this war communism from a host of circumstances: famine, lack of resources, malnutrition, etc. And the economy was badly affected by these policies. All these circumstances led Lenin to introduce the new economic policy, or NEP, in 1921. Now, let us see the changes that came about in agriculture under the new economic policy. First of all, Lenin introduced tax in kind policy, which would replace the surplus food appropriation, or the policy which assigned a certain amount of peasants' produce which the state was entitled to, which was popularly known as prodrazvostka. This was meant to ease the burden which war communism had placed on the peasants, and therefore improve their motivation to work, because the motivation to work had completely vanished under war communism for the peasants, because there was no incentive to produce a surplus, because that would be seized by the state. So, uh, in accordance with changes in agriculture, Lenin put before the Politburo the following demands. First was to replace requisition by a grain tax. That is, now the state would not seize the surplus production of the peasants, but in its place impose a grain tax. The second demand was to extend the freedom of the cultivator to use his surplus over and above the tax for local economic exchange on condition of prompt and full payment of the tax. So once the peasant had paid the grain tax, he was free to sell his surplus production in the market and acquire the profit himself. So tax in kind was going to be easy for middle and poor peasants. At the same time, collective responsibility was abolished, and individual peasant was made himself responsible for tax payment. Free trade, sale, and purchase, all of which were nationalized under war communism, were now authorized. However, the objective of the new economic policy was not the creation of new institutions, but transformation of existing institutions, under which compulsion was removed and the individual initiative of peasants was introduced. So, definitely, the new economic policy was very advantageous to the peasants. Also, sewing committees were set up, and we find that the original conception of the new economic policy was that peasants should be given freedom in order to increase agricultural production so that they could dispose their surplus and obtain freedom and security in the tenure of land. Because, as we've seen in the video on war communism, how the peasants reacted to governmental control. They stopped producing any surplus, and they used to produce only the bare minimum that was required to feed their families. In order to get over these circumstances, the new economic policy proved to be very advantageous to the peasants, and now they could sell their surplus in the open market. So, an important function of the new economic policy was to give to the peasants two things on which the peasants set the highest value. First was that he would have the freedom to choose the form in which the land would be cultivated, and the second one was security of tenure. So Lenin said that the future development of agriculture depended on the fact that those peasant farms which were least profitable, most backward, small, and scattered be gradually amalgamated into large scale agriculture. So, an important change came about in the agricultural field, which was the initiation of prodnalog in place of prodrazvostka. Prodrazvostka we have already discussed. It was about the compulsive seizure of peasants' surpluses by the state, and in the place of prodrazvostka, prodnalog was introduced. Prodnalog, which meant tax in kind. So this prodnalog policy essentially meant the end of requisitioning of grain from the peasant by the state and payment of tax in kind by the peasant, which was indeed a great source of relief for them. Now, let us look into the changes that came about in industry. The new economic policy, in its inception, was a policy for agriculture and by implication for internal trade. So, basically, the new economic policy targeted at changes in agriculture, although some changes were brought about in industry as well. Now, the reference to industry was the revival of transport and industry that would permit the Soviet power to receive the products of agriculture in the normal way, that is, by exchange for the products of factories and home industries. That is, when the peasants would sell their surplus in the market, they could exchange the grain surpluses for products of factories. So Lenin remarked that factories would produce those things which would be socially useful and not those which would be profitable. And the initial steps of new economic policy in industry were two decrees issued by Sovnarkom in May 1921. So the first decree talked about taking necessary measures to develop rural and small industries in the form of private enterprise or cooperatives. And the second one was to put an end to the operation of the decree of November 1920, which nationalized all industrial enterprises, and there was a return to private management. So Lenin felt that certain elements of capitalism needed to be introduced into the Russian economy because extreme communization was not favoring either the peasants or the workers or the larger section of the poorer lot of the economy. So he called it the capitalist experiment, and therefore the cornerstone of new economic policy was to separate large scale nationalized industries from direct state management. Trusts were formed, and as already discussed, NEP was basically a policy for reforms in agriculture. So, in agriculture, the new economic policy quickly provided stimulus to production, leading to economic rehabilitation of Russia. But in industry, achievements were slower. And the initial aim of new economic policy was to provide quick and sufficient returns to peasants for their products. So, first, small and rural industries were stimulated, and light consumer industries were encouraged at the cost of heavy industry. This was one adverse influence of new economic policy in the industrial field. So, these were basically the measures which were undertaken under the new economic policy in the fields of agriculture and industry. And the main issue was that Prodrazvostka was replaced by Protnalog, and now the state could not seize the surplus production of the peasants, but the peasants were given the freedom to sell their surplus in the open market and enjoy the profit and exchange their surpluses for products of factories and small industries. So these were the changes that came about in agriculture and industry. In the second part of the lecture on new economic policy, we will talk about that the changes that came in the field of labor and trade unions, trade and distribution, and finance. So this is all for the video. If you like the video, please like and subscribe it. Thank you.